What if death is not the end, but a return to something timeless within you that has been quietly guiding your life all along? Imagine for a moment that your soul is not extinguished at death, but awakened, called back through a symbolic journey that mirrors the deepest truths of who you really are. This is not a question of faith or dogma, but of psychological insight, a look into the hidden architecture of the soul that quietly prepares for death as it lives. The idea that the soul or psyche continues beyond the ego is a fundamental concept rooted in depth psychology and symbolic thought. The ego, in this context, represents the conscious self, the part of the mind that interacts with the outer world, forms identity, and experiences time, space, and cause-effect relationships. However, the ego is only a small island in the vast sea of the psyche. Beyond it lies a deeper, more expansive domain, often referred to as the unconscious, which contains both the personal unconscious, composed of repressed memories, forgotten experiences, and subliminal impressions, and the collective unconscious, a vast field of universal symbols, instincts, and archetypes shared across all of humanity. When considering what happens to the soul after death, one must view the soul not as a theological construct, but as a psychological reality. It is the totality of all psychic content, conscious and unconscious. From this perspective, death is not the destruction of the soul, but the dissolution of the ego's boundaries. The conscious mind, limited by time, physical form, and biological necessity, is what dies. But the deeper layers of the psyche, particularly those which are archetypal and transpersonal, are not bound by the same limitations. They are timeless, impersonal, and deeply rooted in a shared psychic structure that transcends individual existence. The ego fears death because it sees death as its annihilation, and in a way it is right. Death does mean the end of ego consciousness as we know it, but this is a misunderstanding of the true nature of the psyche. What is lost is not the entirety of the self, but the narrow lens through which we view ourselves during life. Once that lens is broken, the soul is no longer confined to the structure of identity it built over a lifetime. It begins to reabsorb into the greater whole, becoming part of the deeper reality that was always present, but often obscured by the noise and demands of conscious life. There are many moments in life that mimic this process: dreams, deep meditation, near-death experiences, and even intense emotional or spiritual states in which the boundaries of the ego dissolve, and one feels immersed in something greater. These moments give a glimpse of what the psyche may experience in death. The transition from ego to self, from individual consciousness to the total psychic reality, is not one of disappearance, but of return. The self, in this context, refers to the organizing principle of the psyche as a whole. It is both the source and goal of the individual psyche, holding within it all that we are and all that we could become. In death, it is thought that the soul merges with this deeper structure, the images of afterlife that appear across cultures, of crossing rivers, entering caves, meeting ancestors, or merging with light, are all symbolic representations of this return. These symbols come from the unconscious and reflect its intuitive understanding of death not as a failure or punishment, but as a reintegration into the universal order. The psyche, when unshackled from the ego, re-engages with the timeless patterns from which it emerged. Importantly, this perspective does not necessarily assert that the personality continues in some ghostly or personal form. Rather, the soul's continuation lies in the persistence of psychic patterns, the return to archetypal wholeness. What we have experienced, learned, and integrated during life does not vanish, but becomes part of a larger psychic matrix. The deeper psychic reality contains the essence of the individual, not as a fixed self, but as a process, a dynamic flow, an ongoing participation in the unfolding of existence. Thus, death is not a rupture, but a transformation. The narrow walls of the ego fall away, and what remains is the enduring core of the psyche. This core, this soul, continues not in the way the ego imagines, with names, dates, roles, and memories, but as a living current within the deeper waters of psychic reality. It flows into the collective stream, still distinct in form, but inseparable from the whole. This is not a matter of belief, but of inner experience. Dreams of the dead, intuitive visions, and the universal symbolism of death all point toward a continuity that transcends material form. The psyche knows more than the ego allows, and in death, the soul is freed to remember what the ego forgot, that it was never alone, never separate, but always part of something eternal, infinite, and profound. Throughout human history, death has never been merely a biological event. In dreams, myths, and religious narratives, it consistently appears as a transition imbued with powerful symbolism. This symbolic representation of death is not accidental, nor is it simply a poetic way of avoiding the harsh reality of dying. Instead, it reveals a deeper psychological truth about how the human psyche understands and processes the end of physical life. From the perspective of depth psychology, the symbolic language of death offers insight into the workings of the unconscious mind, where death does not signal destruction, but transformation. The unconscious does not think in literal terms. It expresses itself through images, stories, and metaphors. When death appears in a dream, it rarely signifies physical demise. More often, it represents change, the end of one phase of life and the beginning of another. In this way, symbolic death is experienced repeatedly throughout life, in moments of loss, transition, identity shifts, or spiritual awakenings. These psychological deaths mimic the ultimate death and prepare the soul for what lies beyond the threshold. In mythology, death is almost always followed by some form of rebirth, whether in the story of Osiris in ancient Egypt, Persephone in Greek lore, or the crucifixion and resurrection in Christian tradition. The pattern remains consistent. Descent into darkness is followed by a return to life in a new form. These myths are not mere cultural artifacts. They are expressions of archetypal realities embedded within the human psyche. The descent into the underworld reflects the soul's movement inward, away from the outer world of the senses, into the interior domain where transformation occurs. In this inner realm, symbolic images take precedence: caves, rivers, gates, boats, shadowy guides, all elements that point to the psyche's intuitive grasp of what death entails. The underworld itself is not a place of punishment, but of deep encounter. It is where the soul confronts the unknown, faces its own hidden truths, and begins the process of integration. The recurrence of such symbols across time and culture indicates that the unconscious holds a consistent view of death, not as an abrupt end, but as a necessary phase within a larger cycle. Just as nature moves through cycles of growth, decay, and renewal, so too does the psyche. Death is the winter before the spring of renewal. It is the dark night that precedes the dawn of deeper awareness. In dreams, when someone dies, or when the dreamer faces death, it often signifies that a certain way of being has outlived its usefulness. Something must be relinquished so that something new can emerge. In this sense, symbolic death is an essential aspect of inner development. Without it, growth would be impossible. The psyche clings to old patterns. and only through symbolic death does it find the courage to let go. The unconscious uses these death symbols to guide the individual through life's transitions. They appear during times of psychological crisis, grief, or personal transformation, indicating that the inner self is undergoing change. The more resistant the ego is to this transformation, the more intense the symbols may become. But when embraced, they become powerful agents of rebirth. This symbolic function of death extends to what is traditionally thought of as physical death as well. The dream system logic suggests that the soul will continue its journey beyond the physical form in much the same way it has done through psychological deaths during life. What appears to be an end is understood by the unconscious as a passage, a movement into a different mode of being. The dream state itself offers a useful analogy. When we sleep, the ego fades and we enter a symbolic world not governed by physical laws. In dreams, we meet figures who have died, speak with them, and often receive messages or insights. These encounters are not merely emotional echoes. They point to the idea that the psyche maintains a connection with something beyond time and space. The symbolic representations of death suggest that the soul moves into a reality shaped not by physical matter, but by meaning, myth, and inner truth. This realm is structured by archetypes, universal images that carry deep significance. The death-rebirth archetype is central to this structure. It tells us that death is not a vanishing, but a deepening. Life is not interrupted by death, but completed through it. What begins as loss is transformed into initiation. The soul passes through the symbolic veil not to be erased, but to be reconfigured according to a higher order, one that the conscious mind can only begin to comprehend through symbols, dreams, and stories. The idea that the soul undergoes an archetypal journey after death is grounded in the understanding that the human psyche is not a blank slate, but shaped by universal patterns known as archetypes. These archetypes are not inherited memories, but rather innate structures of the unconscious mind that influence the way individuals perceive, dream, and relate to the world. Death, like birth, love, and transformation, is surrounded by powerful archetypes that structure the experience in deeply symbolic ways. The journey of the soul after death, then, is not random or chaotic. It follows a sequence that reflects these timeless patterns which have expressed themselves in myths, visions, and inner experiences across cultures. One of the most prominent of these archetypal patterns is the journey into the underworld. In countless mythologies, the soul departs the realm of the living and descends into a hidden, often shadowy world. This world may appear as a dark forest, a labyrinth, a cave, or a river crossing. The imagery varies, but the psychological function remains the same. The soul leaves the external, ego-centered world and enters a domain where inner truths are revealed. This descent represents a shift from consciousness to unconsciousness, from control to surrender, from the known to the mysterious. In this space, the soul is stripped of its former identity, forced to confront what was hidden, denied, or unintegrated during life. In the course of this journey, the soul often encounters figures that represent aspects of itself. These inner figures are not just memories of people once known, but are personifications of archetypal forces: the guide, the shadow, the anima or animus, and the wise old man or woman. The guide may appear as a ferryman, a priest, a deity, or even a deceased loved one. This figure symbolizes the part of the psyche that knows the terrain of death and transition. The guide does not save the soul, but helps it navigate the unfamiliar territory. The shadow, on the other hand, represents all that was rejected or unacknowledged in life. It is often a terrifying or painful figure because it confronts the soul with its own moral and emotional blind spots. Meeting the shadow is a moment of truth, where illusions fall away, and the soul must reckon with its full self, not just the socially acceptable parts, but everything it has ever been. The presence of the anima or animus, representing the feminine in the male psyche and the masculine in the female psyche, signals the soul's need to integrate its opposite, to become whole. These figures often appear in dreams and visions as lovers, muses, or spiritual companions. In the post-death journey, their appearance marks a stage in which the soul moves beyond ego-bound identity and opens to a fuller version of itself. The wise old figure, frequently depicted as an elder, sage, or divine presence, embodies the final stage of this inner journey. It represents the self in its most integrated form, the unification of opposites, the realization of inner harmony, and the return to the source. This journey is not experienced in linear time. The soul does not follow a clock or calendar. Instead, it moves through symbolic time, where events unfold in relation to inner readiness and psychic necessity. The journey may feel like a moment or an eternity, depending on the depth of the soul's engagement with its own truth. At each stage, the soul is confronted with tasks, tests, or invitations. These are not external judgments, but internal unfoldings. The soul is invited to understand, to reconcile, and to remember its deepest nature. The process is not punitive. It is therapeutic, cleansing, and ultimately transformative. It is a continuation of the individuation process, the lifelong movement towards self-realization and wholeness that continues even beyond physical life. But archetypal journeys after death are not to be taken as literal predictions of what happens after bodily death. Rather, they provide a psychological map for understanding how the soul might respond, symbolically and experientially, to its release from the material world. The universality of these motifs points to a shared inner wisdom that humanity carries within its collective unconscious. Whether through dreams of deceased loved ones, visionary experiences, or mythic traditions, these archetypes offer a coherent pattern that helps the living understand the mystery of dying and prepare the soul for the journey ahead. The journey itself is not foreign to the soul. It is something the soul remembers, something it has always known at the deepest level, and something it must ultimately walk through alone, yet accompanied by symbols and guides it carries within. The concept that death represents a return to the self, rather than an end of the self, touches on a profound psychological truth. During life, much of our identity is built around the ego. The conscious mind that navigates the world, maintains roles, pursues goals, and constructs a sense of individuality. The ego, while necessary for functioning in the physical world, is not the totality of the psyche. It is only a small part of a much larger inner landscape. Beneath and beyond the ego lies the self, a central archetype representing the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, individual and universal, temporal and eternal. It is the organizing principle of inner life, often hidden beneath the noise of daily existence, but always present, quietly guiding from within. As life unfolds, the ego is meant to grow in awareness and eventually move toward alignment with the self. This process, known as individuation, involves recognizing and integrating the many parts of the psyche, the shadow, the inner child, the opposite gender within, and the voice of inner wisdom. It is a movement toward wholeness, a gradual realization that the personality is not isolated, but deeply connected to something larger and more timeless. This path is not without suffering. It demands the death of illusions, the surrender of control, and the confrontation with one's own depths. Yet it is through this journey that the soul grows inwardly rich, refined, and prepared for what lies beyond the veil of physical existence. At the moment of physical death, what ends is the ego's hold on the body and the sensory world. The roles, identities, and goals it constructed fall away. But from the perspective of the psyche, this is not a collapse, it is a release. The soul returns to its original center, the self, from which it emerged at birth. The death of the ego is not the death of consciousness, but the return of the soul to the deeper ground of being. In this sense, death is less a disappearance than a homecoming. What was fragmented becomes whole. What was striving becomes still. The soul no longer identifies with temporary forms and outer names, but with the enduring essence that was always there beneath the surface. Dreams and near-death experiences often reflect this return to the self. Individuals report encounters with light, with overwhelming feelings of love, with a presence that feels familiar yet beyond comprehension. These are not simply hallucinations, but expressions of the inner psyche responding to its own return. The light seen at the end of the tunnel, the panoramic life review, the encounter with the transcendent being. These are images of the self. They symbolize the soul's recognition of its source. This recognition is not based on belief or dogma, but on an intuitive knowing, a deep sense that one is being gathered back into a reality that is at once personal and cosmic. The self is not something external. It is within, yet it transcends the boundaries of the personal mind. It contains all opposites, light and dark, joy and sorrow, life and death. When the soul returns to the self, it is not escaping reality, but entering into a more complete and unified form of it. This movement is not regression, but integration. All that was lived, suffered, and loved becomes part of a greater whole. The personality does not vanish in the way the ego fears. Rather, it is transfigured, absorbed into a deeper unity where individuality is preserved, not through separation, but through resonance with the universal. Symbols of this return are found in sacred texts, myths, and spiritual teachings from all corners of the world. The soul crossing a river, ascending a mountain, entering a temple, or becoming one with the stars. Each is a metaphor for returning to the self. The self, unlike the ego, does not fear death. It understands it as a transition, a completion of the spiral that began with birth. In moments of deep reflection, meditation, or spiritual insight, individuals may glimpse this reality even while alive. They may feel that beneath the surface of their ordinary life lies a vast presence that knows, accepts, and embraces all. That presence is the self, the inner ground to which the soul returns, not as an escape from life, but as its fulfillment. Throughout life, the psyche shows an unmistakable tendency to prepare itself for death, not only as a physical event, but as a deep psychic transformation. This preparation is not always conscious, but it appears in symbolic forms. Dreams, emotional states, and shifts in inner orientation. As individuals age or confront serious illness, they often undergo a psychological transition that seems to loosen their attachment to worldly concerns. What once seemed urgent, ambition, possessions, status, begins to lose its grip. In its place, a quieter, more reflective mood emerges. This inward turning is not a withdrawal from life in despair, but a meaningful response from the deeper layers of the psyche, signaling the beginning of an inner preparation for what lies beyond. This process often begins with a soft but persistent call toward introspection. People may begin to review their life, not in terms of external success, but in search of meaning. They look back at decisions, relationships, joys, and regrets, seeking to integrate their life experience into a coherent whole. This inner review is not simply memory. It is a symbolic sorting, an attempt by the psyche to make peace, to understand, and to release. Patterns emerge. Forgiveness is sought. Unresolved emotions rise to the surface, and old wounds seek closure. These movements are not accidents, but part of a natural psychological process. It is as if the soul wants to carry only what is essential across the threshold of death. Dreams during this stage often become more vivid and symbolic. They may feature departed loved ones, journeys through mysterious landscapes, encounters with archetypal figures, or the appearance of light and passageways. These dreams are rarely chaotic. Instead, they follow a subtle inner logic, pointing to the soul's preparation for a different mode of existence. The symbolic world grows more active as the ego loosens its control. In some dreams, death is personified not as a threat, but as a companion, a guide, or even a comforting presence. These images speak to the psyche's ability to reframe death not as annihilation, but as transformation. Such dreams are the unconscious mind's way of guiding the ego toward acceptance and inner reconciliation. The psyche also begins to shift its values. What once defined the self, profession, public image, or material achievement, fades in importance. In its place, symbolic concerns arise: the state of the soul, relationships with loved ones, spiritual questions, and existential meaning. Many people in this stage express a desire to put things in order, both outwardly and inwardly. They want to speak the truth, express love, resolve conflicts, or pass on wisdom. These urges are not just psychological. They are the soul's movement toward wholeness. The individual begins to act not from fear of death, but from a growing awareness of the sacredness of life and the inevitability of transition. There is a quiet wisdom in this stage, a shift from doing to being, from striving to presence. Symbols of departure often appear in waking life as well. People may become drawn to nature, to solitude, or to stories and music that carry deep emotional resonance. Time is no longer experienced as endless. It takes on a deeper quality. Moments are savored with more intensity. The mundane becomes infused with significance. The psyche's effort to reconcile the eternal with the temporal. It is as though the soul is rehearsing its return to a larger reality, slowly letting go of the ego's insistence on permanence. There is also a rise in synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to reflect an inner pattern at work. Encounters, events, or images may arise that feel mysteriously timed, offering insight or comfort. These experiences are not random. They express the unconscious reaching outward, attempting to mirror the inner process of transition. They point to the idea that life is not a linear progression, but a symbolic journey, one that continues even as the body nears its end. This preparation for death is not limited to the final days or hours. For some, it begins years in advance, unfolding slowly and subtly. The psyche does not rush. It reveals its insights in dreams, moods, intuitions, and quiet moments of clarity. Death, in this light, is not a foreign event, but a chapter the soul has been preparing for all along. The psyche, in its depth and wisdom, knows that death is part of the soul's unfolding, and it begins the work of transition long before the final breath is taken. Through symbols, inner shifts, and the soft erosion of ego-bound identity, the soul prepares itself to move from the temporal into the timeless. In the quiet architecture of the psyche, death is not an annihilation but a transition. It is the soul's inward return to the self, guided by archetypal patterns that have always lived beneath our conscious awareness. From the symbolic journey after death to the dissolution of ego, from inner visions to the deep preparation of the psyche itself, the experience of dying unfolds not as chaos, but as an ordered process of integration and meaning. Life does not merely end, it completes itself in death. And through that completion, the soul moves not into darkness, but into wholeness, into the timeless ground from which it first emerged. To truly live is to slowly prepare for that return, not in fear, but with reverence for the deeper mystery that holds us beyond this life.